Have you got stiff ankles? Well, our foot function is heavily integrated with our ankle function, and so restrictions in our ankle's movement will have a major effect on how our feet experience load. It also affects our ability to efficiently perform movements like walking, running, squatting, and jumping, and we end up with a bunch of different compensations throughout our whole body to move around our stiff ankles. So why do ankles get stiff? Well, injuries like ankle sprains can play a role, but for the most part, it essentially comes down to a lack of use. Our modern conventional footwear, artificially flat and level ground, and our disconnection from ground-based movements and resting positions are the biggest contributing factors to this lack of use and should all be addressed as part of a long-term strategy. Of course, some targeted exercises addressing our strength and mobility are a great idea too, and you can check out our full YouTube video on how to get started with that. All right, so our ankle joint is really more of a complex of joints. There's a few joints going on there, so we'll do a very brief anatomy physiology lesson. We've got the shin bone, the tibia that runs down. You've got the outer shin bone, or the other bone in your leg, the fibula that runs down, and that joins onto a bone in the foot called the talus. And at that joint, called the talocrural joint, you get these movements of dorsiflexion, so toes coming up like that, and plantar flexion, toes pointing. So ideally you want about 20 degrees dorsiflexion and 50 degrees plantar flexion. Obviously everyone is a little bit different in genetically and just how their body moves, but you do want to have access to those ranges of motion. Then below that talocrural joint you've got the subtalar joint, and primarily at that joint there are the movements of inversion and eversion. So eversion going out like that, inversion going in like that. And so ideally for inversion you want about 20 degrees, eversion you want about 10 degrees. So those are the movements, and obviously you have all of these muscles in your leg, on the outside of your leg, the inside of your leg, the front and the back, that connect into the foot to produce those movements and to control those movements. And the whole function of that is to work with the foot in its role of absorbing force from the ground. So with that force absorption, you're looking mostly at that dorsiflexion and eversion, and that actually forms part of the pronation movement that we talked about in our last video last week. For the force production, you're looking more at that plantar flexion movement and inversion movement, and that forms part of the foot supination that we talked about in last week's video. And so that creates the rigid lever of the foot so that it can produce force and push into the ground for walking, running, jumping, etc. Now, the dorsiflexion movement is also a very important component of being able to sort of squat down like this and get down into these sort of deeper ranges of motion on the ground, being able to kneel down like that, etc. And so when our ankles get stiff, we often lose access to these deeper ranges of motion, and we reduce our efficiency when it comes to all those functional movements that I talked about as well. So in terms of how the ankle gets stiff, ankle injuries are actually one of the most common sporting injuries. They are the most common sporting injuries, especially the inversion ankle sprain, and that can contribute to some stiffness, especially if it's not rehabbed well afterwards, which often they're not. And there are some genetic components as well in terms of how far you can move, especially into dorsiflexion, but just ankle movement in general. So injuries play a role, genetics do play a role, but we can't really control those factors. But there are other factors that we can control that definitely play a role as well. And so the first one I'm going to talk about is, of course, modern footwear. That elevated heel, obviously if I'm standing in that elevated heel all day, then I'm in more plantar flexion and less dorsiflexion. So that kind of acts like a little bit of a cast in terms of reducing how much time and how far I go into that dorsiflexion. Obviously just the rigidity of the shoe in general, not being able to twist it, all of that will affect how much inversion, eversion happens. Not to mention if you've got things like anti-pronation or supportive shoes, then that can affect how much movement happens at the foot and the ankle as well. So that's one major factor. The other major factor is just the constant exposure to flat and level ground. Obviously this is a bowls green. handy to be flat and level, but when you look out at all of the landscape surfaces, you know, streets, footpaths, your floors at home, at the office, everywhere is just flat and level. And that means, I'll use the soulmate to demonstrate, but that just means that we don't really get much incidental movement of the ankle. You know, say on a rock or a log, if I'm walking along, then my ankle just gets in that position while I'm navigating through, you know, over a surface like that. This is obviously just to supplement or to visualize, but you get the idea there. If I'm walking along and I have to get over this terrain, then my ankle just happens to get into these ranges of movement. But if all I'm exposed to is flat level ground, then I just don't get, I'm not encouraged to use those ranges of motion. The other aspect is, of course, we are just disconnected from these ground resting postures, positions like squatting down there. That's a very fundamental human resting position and a transition movement, you know, down into the ground. You've got kneeling positions that get you into a lot of plantar flexion. You've got half kneeling positions that are dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. But us modern humans don't really use these positions very much because we just sit in chairs, lounges, cars, and so on. And so those three factors play a massive role in how much we use our ankles, and we can control those factors, and they should definitely be addressed in terms of a long-term strategy. So today we're going to be going through some exercises and movements to target your ankle mobility and function, but it's highly recommended to use those in tandem with this sort of broader strategy of changing or transitioning your footwear to more natural footwear that allows more natural foot and ankle movement, getting out and exposing yourself to more uneven terrain, roots, logs, rocks, and so on. Or, you know, you can use a soulmate as a supplement to that, especially that's a great way to build up towards it. Or if you don't have a soulmate, you can use your own kind of combination of a towel and a dowel and so on, which we show you how to do in our Transform Your Feet with a Towel video. And also just gradually spending more time down on the ground in these various ground resting and kneeling positions is really handy if you can tolerate it, or at least building up towards that as well. All right, so first exercise, quite a simple one, but can be really challenging, is just some ankle circles. So I like to be in this position where you're sort of hugging your knee like that, almost choking your leg a little bit to create stability around here, so you're really just focusing the movement on your ankle. But you can do this one in the same fashion, even if you're just sitting in a chair, if you're unable to get into that position. But all you're doing is just moving your ankle in its fullest range possible, your full range. And so you'd be pointing in and then down into plantar flexion, and then out into eversion, and then up into dorsiflexion, all of those movements that we just went through. And you're just trying to explore your available range as much as you can. So that might be really small circles at first, and that's okay. And might also feel a bit jerky. You can see there's certain points in the movement here where my foot sort of does this kind of movement. I'm exaggerating that. But as I go down here, there's a little bit of a jerk there. So that is normal at first, and over time, as you do more of these, that will just smooth out. And if I go back in the opposite direction, I might find that there's another area that feels a bit jerky, like there. So it's not going to be fully smooth, but just work on that nice and slow. The slower the better. You don't want to just be sort of zooming around like that, because that's not really going to make as much of a difference to the ankle. You want to feel all these muscles working, and you'll probably feel your feet working a fair bit too. So nice and slow, spend about a minute on one side and then do the other side. I won't do the other side in this video just for time purposes, but we'll get up and we'll show these ankle sways. So this is focusing mostly on that inversion, eversion, and you can start with your feet about shoulder width apart or a bit more, and then you're just swaying your whole body across, and you're getting into some of that inversion on one side and then eversion on the other side, as you can see. And then once you sway to the other side, you're getting the opposite on the other side. And swaying back. So that's easier when you're standing far apart because you're not getting as much movement through there. But if you stand closer together and you do the same thing, then you are gonna promote and encourage a lot more movement there. Like so. Again, slow and steady wins the race here. You don't want to just be speeding through it like that. You really want to be slowly rotating, exploring. You're going to feel a little bit of a stretch down the side and in through your foot potentially, especially along the outside of your foot as you do that inversion movement. Just do what you can tolerate. You don't want to be pushing through pain or anything, but exploring your range of motion. You don't want it to feel super easy, like there's nothing happening down there. Just find that balance, listen to your body. So that's ankle sways. The next one is a classic calf stretch. Now I'm going to use a soulmate to demonstrate this, but you could use a rolled up towel or a stack of books or something, whatever you've got at home to just lift the front of your foot up. Actually, I'll show on this side. So that foot goes up on there and you straighten this leg, keep that knee straight, and then to bring on the stretch, you might find this is already a bit of a stretch, but to bring it on more, you can put this back leg forward while keeping that knee straight. You don't want to bend that knee. Keep the knee straight, and then to increase that, you can either walk that front foot further forward, or you could also bring it along in the opposite direction, and then even rotate your body a little bit as well. So for me, I'm not getting quite enough stretch there, so I am going to stack it up. So that just means my foot is higher, and you can do that however you can manage that. Obviously, you've got a soulmate, you do it like this. If you've got anything else at home, just find a way to stack it up. Even just, a bunch of rolled up towels will generally do the job there. So either stepping further forward like that or rotating around like that will get more of a stretch towards the outside of the calf. So once you've found a point where it feels like quite a good stretch, I don't want you to be gritting your teeth like that, scrunching up your face, and you want to be able to breathe through this and relax. And you want to hold that for a good 30 seconds at first. Change sides, do the other side, and you could even build up to sort of 60 to 90 second stretches. I won't do the other side for the purposes of this video, but the next stretch is a plantar flexion stretch, so in the opposite direction. And this is a part where you might actually want to use something on the ground, especially if it's hard ground, a rolled up towel or folded up towel just for a bit of protection on the feet here. And then you're just trying to straighten that leg into that plantar flexion like that, and that is going to really stretch out that ankle. You might find that obviously the toes get a bit of a stretch there as well. And then you could also rotate your foot like this, and that will be a bit more plantar flexion and eversion, or like this, and that'll be a bit more plantar flexion and inversion. So just explore that at your own pace. Again, overall, you're looking for about 30 seconds to start, building up to 60 to 90 seconds over time per stretch. And then I'll just show you what you can do up the top with your body. Once you're in this stretch, you can also rotate your hips away from the leg that you're stretching, and that will create a bit more of a stretch just along up the outside there on that tibialis anterior muscle. Again, breathing, not gritting your teeth and tensing up, breathing, relaxing. And then to make that harder, rather than stepping away, you step closer and really try and straighten this back knee. You might want to use something for balance while you're doing it. That's fine, like a dowel or a wall. That's good. Okay, and then the next one, you almost definitely will want something like a dowel or a wall, but it's just an anterior reach. So I'll show you, you got one stance leg, the other leg is just free out in front of you, and you're actually just reaching this leg as far forward as you can. And you can see here, I'm getting some loaded dorsiflexion of this ankle. So I'm coming forward as far as I can, and all of those muscles are kind of tensing, not necessarily consciously, but they're contracting so that I control that movement, and then I stand back up. This is a really good one for the knee as well. You might find that the knee takes some time to get used to that movement too, but really you're just trying to reach the end of your ankle range of motion and then stand back up. You might go for 5 to 10 reps at a time. Again, you're not trying to speed through that. It's really slowly exploring that range, and you might even want to add a little hold at the end range there where you hold for 3 to 5 seconds and standing up. So it's up to you how you explore that movement. Obviously you'd be doing both sides. And then the last movement I'll show you is, I like to call a rotating raise. So everyone kind of knows a calf raise, up and down like that. That's great for building dorsiflexion, plantar flexion rather. You can also do that off a step to get more of a full range, and then you go through full range dorsiflexion all the way through to plantar flexion like that. That's great. But one of my favorite movements to incorporate all of the directions of the ankle is a rotating raise, where as you're coming up, you're kind of pushing into some eversion. So you really want something for balance here. Pushing into some eversion, rotating out into inversion, coming down, and then you're actually lifting the front of your feet up, and then you're rotating in again. So you can see I just went through eversion, plantar flexion, inversion, dorsiflexion. So all of those movements of the ankle, and again, slow and steady as possible. And obviously you could go in the opposite direction. Now there's a couple of things here. If you're finding that the toes are the biggest limiting factor, stepping on something like a soulmate can take some of that the toe extension demands off, or you can find a similar replacement at home. Sometimes a rolled up towel with your toes hanging over the edge is a good replacement there, but you can still do the same thing. And that actually just gives you a bit more freedom to focus on the ankle without worrying about how it's going to affect your toes. And that also, obviously, like I said before, doing something like that, having some elevation, will get a little bit more range of dorsiflexion. And it's actually quite a challenge. So once you get down, you try and lift up. That's quite a challenge for these muscles that are doing that movement. So those are 6 simple exercises. There's almost infinite different exercises you can do for the ankle, but those are just some to help you get started. We have a bunch of other soulmate mobility sessions specifically targeting ankle dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, inversion, eversion, if you do have a soulmate. And obviously, like I said, all of that should be combined with those other lifestyle, environmental factors of changing your footwear to more natural footwear, getting out and experiencing uneven surfaces and terrain, and sort of reconnecting with those ground-based resting positions and movements.